day 4, and we are going to be covering World War One. So, at this point in history, 1914, 1920 timeframe that we are talking about, it had been a while since the United States had really been involved in a major war like this. If you think about it, really the last major war the U.S. had been involved in would be the U.S. Civil War. Obviously, it had the Spanish-American War happen, but again, that was a very easy victory for the United States. And really, this will be the first time the United States is involved in a war in a global scale like this, involving all kinds of different moving parts. So, sequence of events leading up to World War One. Obviously, the big event that kind of starts all the dominoes falling in this is in Sarajevo, June 18th. Serbian nationalists would associate Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, and then that is going to lead to everything else that happens there. I'll let you read through each of that. Basically, of course, you've learned this probably before in world history too. You have all of these entangling alliances that you could say. You can see the chart there at the bottom, the bubble showing all these different alliances that there were that would lead to Europe falling into massive chaos. So, what are the underlying causes of World War II or World War One? You're going to see nationalism. In a lot of these countries, you had a big growth of nationalism within it. This idea, again, that you don't want to offend, that if you offend another country offends you, you have to take up for your honor. Imperialism, remember we talked about the United States wasn't the only ones involved in imperialism, but imperialism had grown throughout of the world during this time. And you can see that map there showing the colonial empires around the world. Militarism, we had seen growing militarism happening during this time, especially over in Europe. And then all of these secret and public alliances that there were that would lead to that Archduke getting killed and that setting off basically, that being the match that lit the fire going in Europe there. So what are the sides of World War I? You're going to have the Allies, Great Britain, France, and Russia. Of course, eventually that would be the side the United States would join. Russia would leave around the time the U.S. would join. And then you have the Central Powers, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire that would all be part of this. Again, there's another map showing the different sides and showing some of the battles there. So, in 1914, President Wilson had made it very, very clear that he did not want the United States to get involved in World War I. You can see here in his statement of neutrality, he says, "I venture, therefore, my fellow countrymen, to speak a solemn word of warning to you against that deepest, most subtle, most essential breach of neutrality, which may spring out of partisanship, out of passionately taking sides." And he goes on in there to say the United States must remain neutral. And you'll actually even see in 1916 that his campaign slogan is, "He kept us out of war," which is interesting because obviously we are going to get involved in World War I. So, like the War of 1812 and the French Revolution, the trouble for the United States and the trouble and what would eventually pull us into World War I is belligerent powers trying to stop supplies from reaching the enemy. Remember, we talked about the War of 1812. So that's the whole reason we got pulled into that. The English kept stopping our ships and doing things, taking our sailors and that kind of thing. That was happening during the French Revolution, and that's what was causing issues with France and Britain during that time. So with that, you're going to see Great Britain would be the first to declare a naval blockade against Germany. Great Britain started seizing ships, including U.S. ships that were trying to run the blockade. Again, we felt like we were neutral on this so that we could trade with both sides. President Wilson, he would protest the seizure of American ships as a violation of freedom of the seas, as he called it. He said, look, we're not involved in the war. We should have freedom to go wherever we want to on the seas. So why did the United States eventually get involved in World War I? One, German unrestricted submarine warfare. So basically, Germany announced that they would blockade and blockade of anything that it owned, but also blockade of the English Channel and that area, and warned that ships entering the war zone could be sunk. You can see there, I've put a newspaper ad they ran from the Imperial German Embassy, just warning them, saying, hey, we are at war, Germany is at war, and you're taking your life into your own hands if you decide to come over into these waters. In 1915, you'd see the U.S. ship, the British ship, the Lusitania, in which 128 Americans were on, that would be sunk. And 128 Americans would be killed. Wilson would protest the sinking of the American passenger vessels. Germany would back off of this as a result. You'll see, though, in January of 1917, Germany would resume the unrestricted submarine warfare, and that's when Wilson will break off diplomatic ties with Germany. So you'll often hear people that bring up, and they'd like to say as a cause of World War I or why we got involved in it was the sinking of the Lusitania. But you can see the Lusitania was sunk in 1915, and we wouldn't get involved in the war in 1917. So it really is Germany restarting that policy of German unrestricted warfare, submarine warfare. Now, reason number two, our traditional ties with Great Britain. Wilson's policies often favored Britain. We talked about how the relationship between the Britain and the United States had grown very, very strong, and most Americans supported Great Britain. Many Americans were affected by their ancestry. Again, 30% of Americans were immigrants. So you're going to see a lot of people sided with the side that they felt like represented their background the most. And also, British war propaganda would be very, very effective as well. Basically, most of the information you're going to see that the United States finds out about World War I is going to come from Britain. So the way that Britain kind of sells the war to the United States is going to be the way that a lot of people are going to think about it. And then reason number three, a desire for President Wilson. He wanted to make the world a safe place for democracy. And that's something he's going to repeat over and over again. And that falls kind of in line with his foreign policy just in general in regards to Latin America and other countries. He felt like supporting democracy around the world was very, very important to President Wilson. So the immediate causes, 1917. You're going to see in March of 1917, you're going to have the Zimmerman telegram come out. American papers would carry this. This had been seized, or this is information that the British had found out and shared with the United States. And in this Zimmerman telegram, it was basically Germany offering Mexico several different offers if they agreed to support Germany, offers including to get back the land that they lost in the Mexican cession. So going way, way back, saying, hey, if you help us out in this, we will make sure that you get that land. So you can imagine people not very happy about that Zimmerman telegram and seen as an affront to our national sovereignty. The Russian Revolution, March of 1917 also. You'd have Russian revolutionaries who would overthrow the Tsarist government that were there. The Tsar would actually be killed, and they would proclaim a republic. It had bothered Wilson that Russia was not previously a republic. So you're going to see that's why one reason why he wasn't super supportive of them. But unfortunately, in November, Russia would fall to communism. Germany would resume their submarine warfare at this point, sinking 5 unarmed U.S. merchant ships. And this is going to be really what accelerates things very, very quickly up to World War I. So how are we getting prepared for war? Even though we were saying that we were going to stay out of it, we were still getting prepared. In 1916, you'd have the National Defense Act, which increased the size of the regular army. And a month later, Congress would increase the size of the Navy as well by building 50 warships. Again, many Americans did not like this idea, and you're going to see, as a general rule, Americans are not in favor of getting involved in these foreign conflicts. A lot of Americans in the Midwest and West, again, were worried about, by increasing the size of the military and increasing the size of the Navy, that it would be a signal to other countries that we wanted to get involved when we didn't. You will see a lot of anti-war activists during this time, such as populists, progressives, socialists, William Jennings Bryan, Jane Addams, Jeanette Rankin. She'd be the first woman elected to Congress, as well as women suffragists during this time. Would all be against us getting involved in this European conflict. So that brings us to August 6th of 1917. The Wilson administration would create hundreds of wartime agencies and commissions to help mobilize the industry. And you will see that with that, once we do finally declare war in August of 1917, after everything else that had happened that year, you're going to see that quickly it's going to become for the United States. How can we mobilize and how can we prepare ourselves at best to fight in and win this war? You'd have the creation of the Food Administration led by Herbert Hoover, which encouraged Americans to eat less meat and bread. You'd also have the National War Labor Board led by former President Taft, which helped arbitrate issues between workers and their employers. So, what was happening here in the U.S. during the war? You're going to see you have the 18th Amendment passed, prohibition. Beer is seen as very unpatriotic during World War I because beer, again, the whole idea of a lot of beer comes out of Germany. So drinking beer was seen as something that was unpatriotic. And you can say that's one of those things that helped push us into prohibition, even though prohibition had been passed on a state level in a lot of places. You'd also have the final passage of the 19th Amendment. So women finally would be able to get the right to vote. One of the more controversial things you'll have passed is the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918. And both of these acts basically made it that if you spoke out and talked against the government, that you could be arrested and held in prison for that. Now, I put on there, haven't we been here before? Again, think about it. Going all the way back to John Adams, the Alien and Sedition Acts, which had done something very, very similar that said that you could be arrested, if you spoke out against the government in certain ways. And again, the reason that these acts were allowed is because the fear of all the immigrants that had come into the country, a lot of these immigrants coming from these areas that were at war, and there was a fear within the government that the immigrants coming in might try to somehow topple the U.S. government from within the country. Also, during this time, you're going to have the Schenck versus United States case, which is going to set a very, very important precedent and is going to set the precedent of the clear and present danger test. And basically what that means is that in this situation, and the famous example that is always used, is that your free speech rights can be restricted in certain ways. And the example they gave is you can't shout fire in a crowded theater. If you shout fire in a crowded theater, it's going to cause a panic and it could cause people to get hurt. So in this case, the Supreme Court does say, yes, there are there are certain types of free speech which can be very damaging and can be very harmful to people. And that is why they come up with this clear and present danger test. So again, that is a limit on your First Amendment right to free speech now. As far as, skipped one there, the armed forces. In 1917, you have the Selective Service Act passed, which created a system to conscript or draft men into the military. You can see 2.8 million men were drafted during the war. That famous "I want you" for the U.S. Army poster would come out during this time. You'd also have 400,000 units or African Americans serve in segregated units during World War I. Very few of them would be permitted to be officers, and they were all barred from the Marines. W.E.B. Du Bois, though, despite those barriers and not being able to serve alongside whites in the military, he thought that it would be good for African Americans because it would help them to earn equal rights at home after the war if people saw what good of a job that they did fighting during World War I. So, fighting the war. Again, we don't focus on a lot of the specifics of World War I because it happened over in Europe and because our role in it was rather small in a lot of ways. So we don't focus a ton on that. You will see that during the war that the Navy built a record-setting number of ships and created a convoy system of armed escorts for merchant ships. That's one of the first big things that the military had to do was figure out how to protect our ships. Also, you'd have the American Expeditionary Force. We talked about them before, going down to the border to help fight against Pancho Villa there when he was coming over from Mexico, causing issues. Again, General Pershing would be in charge of that, and they would assume the western front of the war by September of 1918. June of 1918, at Chateau Thierry, Americans would stop a German advance there and counterattack. August through October of 1918, you see an Allied offensive through the Argonne Forest, driving the German army back to the German border. And then by November of 1918, you'll see that Germany would sign an armistice. So those last two events that I talked about there really was the last hurrah of the German army. In those surrender terms, which we're going to talk about in more detail, Germany would agree to surrender arms, give up much of their navy, and evacuate any of the occupied territory that they were in. This is an interesting way, again, talking about trying to figure out ways to protect ships during World War I. This way of painting ships was known as the razzle-dazzle. And this was a camouflage used by American ships during World War I. And the whole purpose of it was to make it difficult for the enemy to estimate a target's speed, range, and heading, like where the ship was going. If you look at what it would look like through a set of binoculars there, you can see with the ship that's painted in the razzle-dazzle, it is actually very difficult at first to kind of tell, like, what direction is your ship going and where it's going. Anyway, that's just a cool thing in history to see there. And if you've ever heard the term the razzle-dazzle, now you know where it comes from. War deaths. You'll see U.S. combat deaths would be about 49,000. Twice that number would die due to the Spanish flu epidemic that you would have during that time. Kind of interesting. I've heard some comparisons of that as we're going through the corona epidemic now. But yeah, you're going to see, again, most of the deaths from World War I are going to be due to this Spanish flu epidemic. So the total U.S. fatalities during this time were 112,000 Americans dead. So what were Wilson's 14 points? Rewinding a little bit back to January of 1918, this would be a speech that Wilson would give to assure the U.S. of the reasons why we were entering World War I. And these would be the principles that he would use for world peace and the peace negotiations at the end of World War I. So what are some of the key points from the 14 points? One, self-determination, the idea that a nation should choose its own destiny. Again, this is going in line with Wilson's desire for all countries to be democratic. 2, freedom of the seas. We had heard that earlier in the war. 3, the development of a League of Nations to hopefully get countries working together and prevent what happened at the beginning of World War I and what led to World War I. And then also the mandate system, which is basically the idea that, some countries weren't in a place where they could actually govern themselves democratically very well. So the mandate system was a system of where an area or country was going to be ruled by another country until they were able to be independent. So these are all ideas, again, that Wilson would be pushing for with the Treaty of Versailles. So what happens at the end of World War I? You'd have the Treaty of Versailles. The French and English want to punish Germany. And as a result, Germany is going to be punished. Germany is disarmed. They're stripped of any colonies that they have in Asia and Africa. They're forced to admit guilt for the war. They accept the French occupation of the Rhineland, and they are ordered to pay reparations. These reparations, they've only just paid these off within the past, I think, 5 or 10 years. The League of Nations would be created, which is Article X. Or Article 10 part of the treaty. You're also going to see European boundaries were drawn, creating new nations during within both Europe and within the Middle East as well. So, did the U.S. ratify the Treaty of Versailles? Again, remember, even though we get involved in World War I, Americans are still deeply, during this time, not wanting to be involved in other countries, deeply isolationist. So, despite the many, many attempts of Woodrow Wilson to garner support for the League of Nations, it's going to be very unsuccessful in doing so. Again, Americans didn't have a problem with the treaty. They did have a problem with the League of Nations. Wilson would go out and very aggressively try to publicize the League of Nations across the country. During that time, in September of 1919, he would suffer a massive stroke. He did not die from the stroke, but he was never the same after that. And in fact, one of the kind of interesting parts in history is that his wife actually did a lot of things in the White House during that time. And many people say that she was like the de facto president during that time. Again, Americans were not supportive of the idea of this foreign organization making foreign policy decisions for us. And that's why you're going to see such such hostility by Americans to the League of Nations. And of course, any treaty has to be approved by the Senate, and the Senate would defeat the vote on the Treaty of Versailles 49-35. And again, this cartoon right here does a great job of showing how Americans really felt about the League of Nations and felt like that it was tying our hands and not going to give us freedom as a country, or that it could possibly pull us back into European conflicts. So what effect would the U.S. not joining the League of Nations have on the rest of the world? Well, some people definitely felt betrayed because the League of Nations was still created, just the United States wasn't part of it. By being kind of the world superpower at that time, that's going to be a big issue, the United States not being part of it. And really, the League of Nations isn't going to have a lot of teeth behind it because of that. Also, in this same time, you're going to see a lot of push for the idea of America first, which that campaign idea might sound kind of similar to something that you've heard pretty recently here in this idea of growing nationalism within the United States, but also putting the U.S. first before Europe and before other countries, that we should focus on the United States and our well-being first. So, post-war issues that you're going to see. By 1921, the United States would be in a recession. Because of the recession, you're going to have a lot of anger come out of workers in certain areas of the country. One of the big famous strikes that happens during this time is in Boston. You're actually going to have the Boston police go on strike. Calvin Coolidge, who is the governor of Massachusetts at that time, he deals very, very harshly and basically says, if you're going to go on strike and jeopardize the public safety, that is unacceptable in that. So with that, Calvin Coolidge takes a very tough stance towards them and says, hey, we'll bring in other people to police because you got to have police. And that's actually going to be what propels Calvin Coolidge to fame, which will eventually lead to him becoming president. You'd also have the Red Scare and the Palmer raids. The Red Scare, again, this fear that communism, with Russia falling to communism, that there was a big plot for that same thing to happen there. So you're going to see J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI lead a lot of raids in trying to discover communists and trying to root them out either in the U.S. government or in U.S. society as well. You'd also have the Sacco and Vanzetti case happen within the New England states. They would be found guilty for the crime of committing a robbery and murdering a store owner and be executed. This case is going to get a whole lot of attention because a lot of people felt like that they were not given a fair trial and that the whole reason that they were being treated the way that they were is because they were immigrants. And there's going to be a lot of public uproar in certain areas due to the Sacco and Vanzetti case. Also, you're going to see in 1917, 1919, you are going to have some race riots happen. Again, the Great Migration is continuing to happen into the north, but they're going to have this summer, they call it the Red Summer 1917. St. Louis, you'd have a race riot there, 40 deaths over jobs at a defense plant. That were not given to African Americans. And then Chicago of 1919, you'd have another big race riot, which they believed started at Lake Michigan there because of the separation between whites and blacks and a black gentleman swimming on the white side. And you would have 38 people killed there as well. So things weren't awesome and super stable here at home. So when we look at World War I, what is the legacy of World War I? American entry into the war showed, again, what the rest of the world had started to suspect is that we were a force to be reckoned with. With our resources that we were able to put in the war, we really were able to shift the stalemate that was there and ensure Allied victory in the war. The next big part of this, though, is the failure to bring about lasting peace. When you talk about World War I, you can't talk about it without talking about World War II, because really a lot of the failures at the end of World War I is going to lead directly into World War II. The whole rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany can be, in a lot of ways, can be blamed on World War I because of the Treaty of Versailles and how the Treaty of Versailles dealt so harshly with Germany. Germany could not financially recover from World War I due to the Treaty of Versailles, and because of what that did to the German economy and what it was doing long term to the German economy. That really is what paved the way for Hitler to come to power, because he was able to seize on discontent over the economy, eventually blame that on a group of people, being the Jews and others, and really paved the way for him. Also, the rejection of the League of Nations left a bitter legacy for other countries. I talked about, again, how us not being part of that League of Nations basically meant that the League of Nations didn't have a lot of teeth behind it. But really, when you look at World War I and World War II, in some ways you can call World War II World War I Part 2, because it really was coming out of the issues caused by World War I. I've actually heard historians that have argued that it would probably have been better for the world if the United States had not gotten involved in World War I, because of how quickly we were able to turn things in the favor of the Allies. So again, that's for historians to talk about, but really just know World War I leads to World War II. In fact, when you are talking about this, one of the interesting things too is within the Middle East and the mandates that you have and how countries got broken up. Because again, a lot of these countries have been part of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire would be the last really empire to have control of the Middle East. So if you ever look at the Middle East today and say, man, why is the Middle East such a mess? Well, it's been through that like that for a lot of history, and really the Ottoman Empire through brute force helped unify the Middle East, even though it wasn't really unified. But getting back to World War I, you're going to see, again, after World War I, and you're going to have the mandate system and how the Middle East gets broken up. A lot of people are not going to be happy about that, including modern day ISIS. When ISIS started to emerge, they actually did propaganda videos going against the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was an agreement signed after World War I in how the Middle East was going to be divided and broken up into different mandate systems. So again, World War I, something that happened now over 100 years ago, still having an influence in the world today, and that ISIS was still upset about the borders created under the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Now you're going to see here, I'll give you a chance, you can go through these and look at all these different propaganda. You're going to see this is really the first war where on a large scale basis, you are going to see a ton of propaganda coming out of all nations and coming out of the United States as well. Again, I really like that one there with the Statue of Liberty pointing at people there. So again, kind of ending with World War I, know the legacy of World War I and what World War I meant for the world going forward, and how it kind of paved the way for Hitler and a lot of the nationalist movements that you're going to see within Europe, but also within Japan as well, because Japan had helped out in World War I, and they left the bargaining table at the Treaty of Versailles, or at the Versailles Peace Conference, feeling like that they didn't get anything out of it, and questioning why they had even bothered helping in World War I as well. So hope you got something from this, and I hope you have a fantastic day.